Health, Psychology, and Human Nature with André Sturesson. Hey friends, hope you're having a great day. Are you following me on Instagram and Facebook? Please go to Health, Psychology, and Human Nature on Instagram or Facebook, or both for that matter, to get the latest episodes, inspiration, and more. Please take a pause and go there. Also, if you like the episode, please share it with a friend, family member, or somebody else who you think might like it. Welcome back, friends, to Health, Psychology, and Human Nature, a science-focused podcast where we explore, learn, and improve our lives together. How does species change over time? And why are we attracted to certain things? Today, me and Professor Richard Prum get into natural selection, sexual selection, and the evolution of beauty. We also get into sexual stuff like why the penis is the way it is, and also orgasms. Richard, he's an evolutionary ontologist, meaning that he really knows his birds and he really knows evolution. He has written the book The Evolution of Beauty, in which he argues for Darwin's long neglected theory of sexual selection, in which the act of choosing a mate for purely aesthetic reasons, for the mere pleasure of it, is an independent engine of evolutionary change, according to Richard. Friends, I really hope you enjoy today's episode. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
It's great to have you here. That's for sure. Today we're going to talk about some interesting stuff, and which you have doing a lot of research about, and I thought that we would start off by talking about natural selection, if that would be all right with you.
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
Cool.
Well, as an ornithologist, of course, a bird biologist, most of my examples are going to be about birds.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and I think that's make it relatable. But natural selection is a process in nature that was first discovered by Charles Darwin, and of course made famous in his analysis of Darwin's finches that live on the Galapagos. And that's one of the great examples, even for modern research. Natural selection is a process where if you have variation that's heritable, that is received or transmissible to the offspring, and some kind of variation in survival or fecundity, that is the number of babies you can have, you will get a change over generations in the form of the organism, and this process is special because it leads to what we call adaptation, which is a fit between the organism and its environment. And the famous case elaborated by Darwin and studied up into the 20th century and today has to do with the shape of the finch beaks in the Galapagos. It turns out that they have a number of species that have radiated on this little set of islands in the Pacific, and the birds vary in the sizes of their beaks. And the more robust beaks, the bigger beaks, are able to open harder seeds, and the finer beaks are able to open smaller seeds more nimbly, or at least more efficiently. And so as a result of the association between beak shape and the availability of the diet, the species have radiated and evolved in these shapes and ways that match their environment. So that's really the concept of adaptation by natural selection.
I think it would be very interesting here to get an example. So perhaps we could take these birds. So long time ago, these birds came to an island, and then there were these in a way.
Yeah. And the idea is that in the parental generation, there will be variation in beak size. And those birds that have beak shapes that match more appropriately the diet that's available will survive long enough to reproduce. And when they reproduce, the offspring will be descended from that portion of the population that had the better functioning beak shapes, and they will inherit that beak shape, and the population will gradually evolve to be functionally adapted to the environment.
Right. So it's those that have better beaks, they are more likely to, to be healthy and to get food and also to reproduce. And then their kids, they will also have a better beak, and then they will probably, or not all of them, of course, but the ones that are like better suited to the environment.
Indeed. And of course, what's powerful about this idea is that it is, the ultimate kind of crowdsourcing. Nobody's in charge.
Yeah.
There isn't an ideal. There's no principles. It just happens, and it happens because there is lots of variation, and there's a lot of differences in functional success, and the result is the kind of amazingly diverse world that we live in today.
Right, because that's also, I think, a very interesting point, that it's not that all of the kids actually are better suited to the environment. Some are also less suited to the environment, right?
Sure, and of course the real standard is whether you're more suited than the next guy or than the other species, right? Because of course there's competition within the species or among species, and that's the field of ecology, which of course is very related to evolutionary biology.
Right. Okay. So birds, for example, that are able to survive better, then they will then they will probably reproduce and get kids that they will also be able to survive. I was also interested to hear. So, if the environment changed, then like what happens to the species then?
Yeah, well, that's actually fantastically demonstrated again by the Galapagos finches, because a pair of researchers, Peter and Rosemary Grant, now at Princeton University, have been studying the Galapagos finches for almost a decade. When in the early 80s, they had a catastrophic El Nino event. This is the weather cycle that dominates some of the areas in the Pacific. And in this particular season, it was a super drought. And so what that meant was that all the little seeds were rapidly eaten by the birds, and the only remaining seeds during the drought time were very large, hard seeds. So they were able to actually document and demonstrate natural selection in the wild, showing that the survival after the drought, the entire population had evolved more robust, bigger beaks, that the smaller beaked birds had not survived, and that their progeny of these survivors had indeed inherited bigger beaks. So this process is responsive explicitly to changes in the environment.
That's very interesting that we have such a recent example.
And it remains probably the best example of natural selection measured in the wild that we have.
Very cool. I was also thinking about, because I found this interesting example for quite a long while ago. What happens to species when they are set on an island? Like, for example, we have this Homo florensis and these really tiny elephants. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that. I think that's interesting.
Sure, there are all sorts of interesting examples of species either becoming isolated out on an island by changes in the level of the ocean floor, or in the case of many plants and birds and other animals, dispersing at great distance out to islands in the ocean. And in this isolation, you tend to see lots of patterns. Sometimes there could be gigantism, like animals getting larger on islands. So if we think of there's some flightless birds on New Zealand that are now extinct, called moas, and they were immense, like way larger than an ostrich or an emu, right? So these are really large. But a lot of times, what happens on islands is animals get smaller. An example, in the Mediterranean, there were woolly mammoths on a lot of the Mediterranean islands that were, about the size of a small couch, or maybe a love seat, right?
Mm.
About waist high at the shoulder. These are really, a kind of cute woolly mammoths, but they were island forms. And of course, there's one example from Homo erectus, one of our early hominin relatives, which distributed or dispersed out of Africa some 2 million years or so ago, and with one small population becoming isolated on an island in Indonesia and evolving to very small size, reduced in size and they've often been referred to as hobbit hominins, right? So diminutive, under I think 3.5 feet or so, a little over a meter tall.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So we had this 1 meter tall pre-humans.
Yes, and that apparently endured well into the period when Homo sapiens was found also in the area. So they lived along with us to about, I think, 17,000 years ago. So that's a interesting evolutionary phenomenon, to think back to the time when there were more than one human species on the planet at the same time.
Yeah, and that perhaps also is a good example of, I mean, it's not that species become better. I mean, it's that they become better adapted to their environment. So if you would have been really big Homo erectus on this island, then you would probably die, because it's quite costly to have a big body.
It may be that the ecosystem does not have enough resources to hold a large-bodied populations, et cetera. There's all sorts of reasons that these populations could have been reduced in size.
Right. Cool. And we as humans, we've also done this, right? I mean, we haven't done natural selection. I don't know exactly what the term is, but I mean, we've taken wolves and made them into chihuahuas, right? And
yes. Well, artificial selection is what we would call it, and that's what Darwin called it. And artificial selection was a big part of his book on natural selection, The Origin of Species. And he argued explicitly from agriculture, from farm animals or domesticated animals like cats and dogs, that the humans, through selecting on their inherent variability, had transformed them into a diversity of forms, from the Saint Bernard to the Chihuahua.
Yeah.
And that's exactly right. That shows the potential, the amount of genetic variation available to selection in a wild species like the wolf.
Exactly. I think it's very interesting how we as humans really have changed everything that it fits us better, kind of.
Well, certainly, and plants, of course, plants like corn and wheat, through their adaptability, have transformed the planet. Michael Pollan, in a fascinating book on the botany of desire, some years ago, wrote that yes, we're using corn and wheat, but they've also used us, because we're down other ecosystems to grow corn and wheat and rice. So from their perspective, they've done very well for themselves, propagated over a huge amount of the surface of the planet by being useful to us.
That is very true, and it's also, I mean, some species that survive better in cities. Doves, for example. I mean, they must have grown quite exponentially as well.
Sure. And what's interesting about a lot of the pigeons, doves, is that many of them, especially the rock dove or the common pigeon, nested originally, this species, on rock faces, on cliffs, and of course, when we started to build buildings, that was the side of buildings is exactly like a cliff, so they took very well to our disruption of the environment. Of course, now found on every continent but Antarctica for sure.
All right. So before we head over, I think we're going to head over to sexual selection now. But before, so if you would conclude, like if you would summarize natural selection, then what would you say that natural selection is?
Natural selection is a process that gives rise to adaptation, that is a fit between the organism and its environment, and it has led to an amazing diversity of organisms on the planet, and so it's clearly a fundamental and important force in explaining and understanding biodiversity and ourselves.
Very interesting. All right, so now we're going to head off to the next section here, which is sexual selection. So what is sexual selection?
So Darwin also coined the term, and to Darwin, natural selection was about variation in survival and fecundity. That is, whether you live to reproduce, and then how many babies you were sort of economically or materially capable of producing. But Darwin realized that there were lots of things that didn't further the survival of animals that had evolved. And so, for example, the antlers of a deer or a moose, right, or the beautiful feathers on the tail of a peacock. And what he realized that these things did not actually further survival or directly in material parts of reproduction. They must be for something else. And obviously, antlers are armaments that are used for fighting, and beautiful feathers and beautiful songs are used in courtship. So he, instead of trying to rest on his laurels and as maybe the most famous Victorian scientist in the world, he, in a very foxy way, developed a whole new theory of evolution, a whole new mechanism of evolution that he called sexual selection. And the idea was that if there was heritable variation in traits or in features of the animal that led to differential mating or fertilization success, that those features would evolve. And the two kinds of ways in which they could evolve, one was mating competition, usually male-male competition, and the other was mate choice, often female mate choice, but frequently also male and female choice. So there was a difference between mate competition, which usually would lead to armaments, things like large body size or weapons, tools of control, whether it's the antlers of an elk or a rhinoceros beetle, right? And on the other side, in the mate choice, would lead to aesthetic traits that explicitly appealed to the sensory systems of the choosers. And so Darwin was adamant that sexual selection was a distinct form of evolutionary mechanism that could interact with natural selection, but would lead to all sorts of different variations.
Right. Would you say that, or could you say that natural selection is about surviving so that you also can get laid and reproduce, and that sexual selection is more about enhancing your chances of getting laid?
Yeah, well, it really is about variation in reproduction. But of course, reproduction varies tremendously. If you're a bee or a fish or one kind of bird or another kind of bird. So it's not just about mating. It really is about all the things that would contribute to successfully raising more young.
Okay, so but perhaps we can get a little bit deeper on the male to male competition. So what was that all about again? What did you say?
Sure. So in some species, one sex will have the opportunity to compete over control or over access to mates. among one another. And that control within a sex, what's often called intrasexual selection, will lead to the evolution of methods of control, right? Things that are good or useful in fights. So that can lead to, a lion being large in body size and ferocious and defending a group of females from other males, or an elephant seal where the females have to come up to the beach in order to breed, in order to give birth, and by controlling one patch of the beach, the male will have the opportunity to mate with those females after they've given birth and contribute to offspring for this subsequent year. So in all these cases, we end up with a big difference in size between the males and the females, or a big difference in armaments between them.
So it's really, it seems that, so it's really about, like, there's some kind of resource. It could be food, it could be a nice piece of beach, and then you need the muscle to be able to protect and own that in a way.
Right. So it could work both ways. One, the males can go directly to try to control females specifically. But another way to do it is to say, well, the females need that resource, so if I can control that region, then I'll control them. And both of those things evolve in different kinds of organisms.
Okay, so the first one is basically that the males force themselves on females, or I didn't really get that.
Or control their options to the point that they don't have choices. Of course, in many species, females are not interested in choosing. They just going about their lives. So it doesn't necessarily include force, but it would include battle or competition, excluding access to other males.
Right. So it could be like the alpha male, like the silverback, like fights off the competitors to be able to.
Exactly. And then females are in the group and essentially under that single male's control.
Okay, that's interesting. And what is also interesting there is, I think that, like, being big, I mean, that could have some advantages, I guess, for surviving if you need to protect yourself against other animals or against competition. But it's also costly, right? I mean, being big, then
Absolutely.
You need to consume more energy as well.
Yeah, and as a result, being big requires more energy and is often associated with mortality, not surviving. And so, of course, that feeds a skewed sex ratio, which is just fine, because in many of these species, there will be lots of mates, lots of males competing to try to get access. So there's always another guy waiting in the wings.
Yeah, you always gotta have your eyes on your back.
Right. So even if these males don't live as long as smaller bodied females, or some of them don't, that's not a problem for the population.
Interesting, but then the females, they stay more. I mean, the males then get bigger, but then the females, they still stay optimally adapted to their environment, right? Or is that correct?
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, there is a concept of allometry, right? That there are constraints on how different the male and female body size can be. So it's not necessarily that they're optimal, but they're certainly surviving well. Yeah, I do want to note, though, that it's not always about male-male competition. There are cases of female-female competition leading to what we call polyandry, which is a breeding system in which one female mates or has multiple male mates. A great example of this in birds is the bird called the jacana. And these are in the shorebird order, but they have very long toes, and they walk on lily pads. They're found on all the tropical continents. And so they walk on floating vegetation because they have these very, very long toes. And in any case, this is an environment where there's lots of food, lots of bugs. And so a great, easy place to raise babies. So what happens is that the female will establish a territory. And if the territory is large enough, then she will attract multiple male mates. The males build the nest, the female lays the eggs, and the males raise the young entirely on their own. The female, meanwhile, will patrol the whole area, defending her territory from other females who are in the neighboring territories. Right. So this is a case of strong female competition for the resources that males need to reproduce, and actually, in some of these species, have weapons. For example, the jacana in the New World has a little spur on the wrist of its wings that is basically like a little weapon. The Old World jacanas, the radius, the leading edge bone in the forewing has a big blade on it. So they use these essentially as weapons to beat on each other as they are in territorial battles in the marsh. This is a case where competition occurs within a sex, but it's the female that is larger in body size, dominant, and controlling resources that are needed for reproduction.
Does it have to do? Because I also saw some other species where the males were the ones who took care of the children, and then again, as you just mentioned, then it was the females that did the competition, or perhaps it was the females that needed to attract the males, I think.
Yeah, sure. They're singing the songs. They're doing the displays. In some species, the polyandrous species, they're more beautiful, and of course that's getting into mate choice.
Good transaction there. Let's go in there.
Okay, so the flip side, of course, of the other mechanism of sexual selection is mate choice, which, as we already said, can occur with females choice, male choice, or really mutual mate choice, where both sexes are choosing their mates. And as Darwin pointed out, this is based on sensory and social information that's perceived through a series of interactions between the individuals, right? And this leads to the evolution of ornamentation that are observable and displayed during the breeding season, or during mating or courtship, as we often call it.
Right. Okay. So then it's more about, it's not a lot about fighting or protecting resources. Then it's more about trying to get the I guess most often the female to have sex with you.
Right. And so in this case, we're getting into science that is beginning to be disputed, right? So there's a lot of questions about scientific questions and research questions about why females prefer the males they do. What's the benefit of the preference? What is the preference about, and how does it evolve? The two arguments are, first, that it could be merely beautiful, right? That it is actually individuals prefer specific mates because they actually like them, right? That it's subjectively attractive, right? And this is the idea of Darwin's original explanation. And in this case, he thought that it was very much like artificial selection. Breeding for a Chihuahua. People get Chihuahuas not because they're useful, but because they like them, right? Exactly.
Right.
But in this case, instead of being artificial selection, in the case of dogs, this was sexual selection, where the birds themselves were the agents in their own evolution, right? And that they were preferring specific songs or plumages or displays because they like them. Now, how would that evolve? Well, it's kind of like a fashion trend, or if you will. Those females who choose mates that are sexy will have offspring that inherit those features that other females will also or have evolved, or other females will find attractive as well. So this means that a female who makes an attractive mate choice will have male offspring who are also attractive to others, right? So that's the indirect genetic benefit that drives the process of, as Darwin described it, aesthetic evolution.
Right. I think we should just take a little example here just to clarify it even more.
Sure.
So I read somewhere about perhaps that females that they could have different that they could be born with. Let's say that a female is born with a new preference for, let's say, even more red, and then they will try to find like, oh, then there's a bird there that is red, and because she now has this.
Sure. That notion is what's generally referred to as a sensory bias, right? So the idea is how does this preference get started, right? And one potential idea is what we call sensory bias. What that means is that the architecture of the nervous system and the sensory system have evolved in a way that leads to essentially a random or unexpected or certainly arbitrary preference. I mean, the classic case would be, bird or fish evolves to eat red food. So its nervous system really can see red really well. And then all of a sudden a male shows up with a red spot and suddenly it's very salient. It's very attractive. It's like, wow, I see that.
Yeah.
And that could get the whole thing going, right? And so sensory bias is one of the ideas for how you could get sexual selection or mate choice off the ground, if you will.
Exactly. And then after that, as you mentioned, then their sons will probably have the feature that the female liked, and the daughters will probably prefer the same features that their mother liked.
Right, and so the idea here is that this is a genetic version of a kind of fashion trend or a sudden snowball effect of in popularity, right? But driven for its own sake. This concept of mate choice or aesthetic choice means that this trait evolution can be happening, or the display, the sexual ornament can evolve in ways that are potentially wholly independent of adaptation by natural selection. Right. The idea here is that you have to be healthy enough or fit enough in order to survive, but you also have to be sexually attractive enough to pass on your genes, be chosen, and that those two criteria could be quite different and potentially in conflict.
Exactly, and that is the interesting thing. I mean, so if you are, let's say that you're really colorful, that is something that will perhaps then attract the females, but that will also attract the predators.
Right, and so but that may or may not be in the interest of the female to care about.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. I mean, it depends on whether that's her a mate that's providing material benefits like feeding babies and helping raise the young, or not. There are many cases she may not have any reason to care whether that sexually successful mate lives long enough to mate again.
Exactly. And then the interesting thing is, and which your book I think also goes into a lot, the evolution of beauty. So is it just that the females find it attractive, or does the thing that is attractive also says something about the male? So perhaps that it is a good male, right?
Now we get into, like I said, the area of current scientific controversy, because in contrast to Darwin's aesthetic view of evolution, there was, or of sexual selection, there was another perspective that came right out at the time, first articulated by Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a critic of the idea of sexual selection, but also this idea has continued up to today, and that is the idea that sexual selection is really only a kind of natural selection, and that the mate choice evolves because females are preferring traits in those mates that communicate information that is practical, information about quality, that makes their offspring either genetically or materially better. right? And this whole view, in contrast to the aesthetic view of Darwin, is a way of taking ornament in nature and turning it into a kind of utility. I refer to it as a sort of biological Match.com profile,
Right.
where the information, the display indicates all sorts of information that mates need to know, like who are his people, does he come from a good egg, does he take care of himself, does he have a good diet, does he have sexually transmitted diseases, right? Does he smoke, or even what is he smoking,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
These are all the things that and practically that mates might want to know. But it's a different conception about the world because it implies that ornament in the world is bristling with honest information about quality, versus that it's merely beautiful and subjectively attractive to the offspring, to organisms. And so that's why this is an ongoing debate.
But could we also, again, here to exemplify this even more, could you give an example of the two views here?
Sure. A good one comes from research on red plumage in birds, whether it's the pink flamingo, or a North American cardinal, or a rosy finch, or rose finch in Europe. These are species that gain the pigments that go into their feathers from their diets. These pigment molecules are called carotenoids. They're the same kind of family of molecules that make tomatoes red and carrots orange, right? And what the birds do is acquire them in their diet, and then in some cases chemically modify them, but then they put them into the feathers. So there is a connection between the plumage color and the material diet, right? And so there's been a long history of research going back 30 years or more, proposing that the redder male is actually better. He's signaling that he has a better diet. And this would be an example of an honest indicator trait, a sexual ornament that would indicate the quality of the male's diet. Now, an alternative view is that this is, merely attractive, that red is a bright, distinctive color, as are orange and yellow and pink, all the other carotenoid colors, each one of which could be attractive, right? And but all come from the diet, right? And so the question is, how might we proceed? One of the things we note, however, is that there's no evidence from wild species that carotenoids are actually rare in the diets of the birds, right? So the kind of main crux or logical support for this concept is actually missing. There's no evidence for it. So one of the things about carotenoids is that they're fat soluble, right? So that means, like DDT, the pesticide that was used a lot in the 50s and 60s, they should bioaccumulate in the ecosystem, but in a good way, right?
Okay.
So so it's very likely that, if you bring a flamingo or a finch into captivity, and you feed it a poor diet, it may not get the carotenoids it needs. But in the wild, it's probably impossible to be a flamingo and not get enough pink feathers, enough pigments to make your feathers beautifully pink, right? And so this idea of honest advertisement of red plumage is wildly popular, but actually very poorly supported.
Okay, so it is about, in this example, the birds. So if it is about if the diet, or if the color says something about the birds or not.
Yeah, is it really information, or is it simply pleasure?
Exactly. And on that, let's say if it would be a scale, like on the one side there's purely information, and on the other side it's purely just because they think it's attractive. Like, where would you put yourself on that scale in general?
Well, I am probably, if I'm known for anything, I'm known as probably the most vocal advocate for the beauty of birds being being purely aesthetic. Yeah, I don't think you get anybody more enthusiastic about that idea than I am.
Right. And
Right, and that makes me a minority in the field. And I must say that in Sweden and in European countries, our academic work on sex selection is dominated by honest advertisement, by the adaptive mate choice hypotheses. And that's why I wrote the book, The Evolution of Beauty, right? It was to try to affect the scientific debate by recruiting a new set of eyes, a new bunch of readers, a new set of voices to participate in this debate.
But when it comes to like let's say a peacock, for example, then wouldn't it be that now I'm playing the devil's advocate, but wouldn't it be that the peacocks that has really nice feathers that the females like, that could also say something about them being able to run away from predators and other things as well, that they're actually good individuals?
Yeah, the idea you're referring to is called the Handicap Principle, and it was developed by Israeli ornithologist Amos Zahavi, who proposed that that honesty was encoded in the ornament because of its costs. That the greater the costs, the male was showing that he really is better at surviving. Like look, I've got this 4-foot long tail dragging behind me, and I'm still alive, right? So that means I must be really better.
The female is like, no, you're just dumb. Why do you have that long tail? No, okay.
And in any case, so that idea has a long popular history. But one of the problems with it, of course, is that if the costs are correlated with the benefits, there's no upside, right? Imagine that a guy proposes to his fiancée, and he gives her an engagement ring that is worth 5 years of salary.
Yeah.
And as a result, they have to both live on the street or in a paper box, right? That would not be good, right? That would be a waste of resources. So there's no upside there. He's showing, look at all these resources I can waste on this ornament, and you know what? Everybody's materially worse off, right? So there has to be an upside, and that's difficult to find in the. So but this idea is attractive to people who are threatened by the idea that natural selection is not the explanation of all of diversity.
Right.
This was not a threatening idea to Darwin. He discovered natural selection, but he understood that it had limited power to describe the world. But this idea of the handicap principle and honest advertisement is a way of, if you will, taking the irrationality of beauty and bringing it back on the ranch. Getting it under control of the rational, algorithm of natural selection. And this, unfortunately, I think evolutionary biology has been recruiting people who are fascinated solely by this sort of intellectual move for decades. And part of my hope is to blow a lid off that thing and try to diversify the kind of minds and the kind of approaches that are in evolutionary biology by recruiting people who are fascinated by the subjective experiences of animals themselves.
Right. But I have to go back to that again. But wouldn't that peacock, when they have nicer feathers, wouldn't that actually be, even though that might not be a good idea evolutionarily to be able to survive, wouldn't it be better than, let's say, another peacock that had smaller feathers, that would it be even worse off perhaps?
Well, but the fact is, it also could be more attractive. That's not an exclusive prediction of honest advertisement, right? I mean, this is the way I put it. Let's imagine we have you could pick your favorite kind of musician, either a violinist giving a concert, or a blues guitarist, or you name it, right? Or a singer. And in the height of the performance, the performer starts to sweat, right? And then the question is, do we like the music that is being performed because we have shown that the performer can still produce it while sweating, or are they sweating in order to make the music that the audience likes? Right? they are both consistent with aesthetic extremity, and there is no primary reason to expect that one of them has explanatory power that the other one lacks, right? And so essentially, I think the attractiveness of this honest adversement and adaptive mate choice comes from a prior commitment to the idea that adaptation is a strong force that explains, all of diversity in nature.
It would also be very interesting to know, like, what are the best evidence for your point of view?
Well, in my book, I have a chapter on a fantastically rare and poorly known bird, but I hope it gets known better.
Yeah.
This is the club-winged mannequin, and actually, I can send you a couple of files of its song, so you can pop it in, edit it in the audio.
Sure.
And the club-winged mannequin lives in northwestern Ecuador and southwestern Colombia in South America, in very humid cloud forests. And this is a bird that we call a lek bird. It has a display where the males perform displays for females that are doing all the nesting. And this male displays and advertises himself with a spectacular sound. But the sound is a song, but not a vocal song. It's a wing song. This is a bird that sings with his wings. And in order to make that sound, which is it's a ringing, tonal sound. He has evolved. The male has evolved these extraordinarily thickened and bizarrely shaped wing feathers, and they make the sound by rubbing together as the male flicks his wings above his back. Right. So they work basically like a cricket. With a process called stridulation, where there's a comb and a pick that scrapes along the edges of that comb, creating a mechanical stimulation of the feather that vibrates like a violin string. Right? It's an extraordinary sound. So that's weird enough, but is that a handicap, or is it merely beautiful? Well, certainly the weird feathers might make it harder for him to fly, so it might think of it as a handicap. But it's also possible that it could be merely beautiful, and this is just the extremity of aesthetic expression. So interestingly, one of my former grad students, Kim Bostwick at Cornell University, did a study on this, showing that in addition to the extraordinary feathers, that the male has extraordinary wing bones, right? In order to make the sound, the male has these greatly thickened, bizarrely shaped wing bones, especially the ulna, which is the trailing bone in the forewing where the feathers, the flight feathers, are attached. So in order to make the sound, he has a huge, bizarrely shaped wing bones. What we've recently discovered is that the female has them too, even though she will never sing a song, right? Now, these wing bones are so extraordinary, it's quite clear that they must disrupt the bird's flight, at least marginally, right? They can't be good for this flight because all birds have these sort of flute-shaped tubular ulnas in their wings, right? That a very characteristic shape. So we know that there's some cost to them. In this case, the females are paying that cost too, but they don't have a benefit. They don't actually sing any songs to attract any mates, right? Like the male. So how could this be? Well, it turns out that the wing bones develop in the embryo, in the egg, before the embryo has become either male or female, right? And so aspects of the wing bones that males need to make the songs are also developing in females because there's no way to build them without doing that disruption. So in this case, females have selected on males in their beautiful wing songs. They have transformed male wing bones, but they also have transformed their own wing bones. They have made them worse. So in this case, I think everybody in the population is made worse off by sexual selection, right? Now, this is extraordinary because it shows that when natural and sexual selection are working in different directions, it really emphasizes the wisdom of Darwin's idea that they are distinct forms, distinct mechanisms of evolution, and that it's hard to define sexual selection as a kind of adaptation, right? So I think of this case of the club-winged mannequin is like a checkmate in the little chess game between Darwin's arbitrary view and Wallace's honest advertisement natural selection view of mate choice.
Right. But couldn't it be that both are correct?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think both of them are clearly happening. The problem is that intellectually, the 20th century and continuing have been dominated by the honest advertisement natural selection view. So there isn't a single textbook of evolution or biology that you could open that wouldn't describe natural selection as a kind, or sexual selection as a kind of natural selection, right? And so that idea, that originally Darwinian idea, is completely forgotten. It has been laundered out of evolutionary biology history. People actually don't read Darwin or don't quote him because his own views are so inconsistent with theirs. Yet they're eager to be considered Darwinian. So they just pay no attention to that to that contradiction.
Right, and that is why you wrote your book, to get the other side out there, that's so people also would see that side.
And indeed, that's exactly
it. All right, how's it going for you then? Like, is the idea spreading, or?
Oh, I think so. I mean, the book has been wildly popular. Did very well. Published in English in 2017. Was cited in a number of ways. Named it as a top 10 book of the year by the New York Times, and was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction in 2018. So received lots of support. It's been we have 6 translations out, and 6 translations in the works. So that's a fascinating bit of success. It certainly has been good for me.
A lot of fun. You even have one in Swedish, right?
Yes, the Swedish edition came out last year.
Can you remember what it was called, or?
Yeah, it's Skönhetens Evolution.
That's really good. Skönhetens Evolution. That's great.
Skönhetens Evolution. Getting closer. If I was there for a few weeks, I hope I would hit it better.
You're very much welcome. We could just spend a week and just learning Swedish. Yeah, very cool. But then also it will also be very interesting to get your ideas a little bit about humans and these things in humans. So what are your thoughts about humans? I think you're written about that in your books as well.
Yes. The last third of the book is really about human evolution, humans are fascinating, and obviously we're important because we're important to us, right? So
yeah, true.
We think we're important, and so but what
nobody else cares. It's just us.
Yeah, what I think it's fascinating about humans is how complicated we are. It turns out every mechanism of sexual and natural selection has been occurring, right? We have female choice and male choice. We have male competition, female competition. We have sexual coercion, right, which is another whole aspect of this, and then we have culture, ideas, and cultural conceptions about sexuality and gender that greatly influence human sexuality. So humans are complicated, but one of the things I try to get across in the book is that there's a lot of things that we can learn about, that we have learned about sexual selection and sexual evolution in birds, that shed important new light on our own evolution, right? In particular, how aesthetic it is. There's a long series of generations of, if you will, Wallacean scientists trying to interpret every aspect of the human body as an honest advertisement of mate quality. And what's interesting is how poorly supported that research is, right? Indeed, I think a lot of human ornaments, the human ornaments in general, sexual ornaments, are quite clearly aesthetic. That is, they have evolved and actually diversified because of subjective experience. The other part about human sexuality is that it's greatly more complicated. The average chimpanzee female will have sex for about 10 days once every 4 to 5 years, right? So, human sexuality is completely unlike that. It has taken on many more roles, social roles. It's much more pleasurable. It's much more diverse. It's much more enduring. And all those features are something that's distinct about human evolution, right? So I actually, the most interesting thing or important thing to describe in human evolution is really how pleasurable sex is, and how diverse it is. So that's what I try to do in the book.
Right. I was just interested to know what you just mentioned there. Like, what are the human sexual ornaments?
Well, that's a fascinating idea. A lot of evolutionary psychology, the field of sort of applying adaptation to the evolution of humans, would be sort of unlimited in its application of what those would be. Of course, they would all be honest advertisements, right? But clearly, there are lots of great examples. One is, we have lost body hair. It could be that fur, if you will.
Yeah.
But that could be have been thermoregulation related. So we could sweat. We have many, many more sweat glands, several orders of magnitude more sweat glands than a chimpanzee. So clearly, we were worried about being able to sweat, and so that's why we lost our fur. But we've retained hair in our armpits and pubic hair, right? Those hairy patches are quite clearly ornamental. One ornament that we have are eyebrows. They're not always sexual ornaments. They're found in young, in babies as well as adults, right? But they're clearly ornamental in function.
Just to understand, like, so these things that you mentioned, there's no real function for them. I mean, are there?
Well, I would say that social functions are vitally important.
Yeah, of course.
As important as any physical function. But eyebrows are not evolved to keep the rain out of your eyes, right? Et cetera, right? And now another feature is that it turns out every mammal species has a breast tissue that is temporary and it expanded only during lactation.
Yeah.
Except for humans.
Yeah.
Right. So it's obvious that on-demand breast tissue is completely sufficient for raising offspring, right? And yet this unique feature that humans have that is absent from all other 5,000 plus species of mammals is notable. And what is that feature? Well, clearly that feature is ornament, right? And the expanded role of sexuality in life and ornament in sexuality expanding, and I think expanding the diversity and pleasure of sex.
Okay, so it's not so breast, for example, having bigger breast is not something that has a function. It's something that
having permanent breasts is not something that has any function other than social.
Really?
No other species, including our immediate, ape ancestors.
Yeah, very true.
Right. So, and another thing, turning to the male body, one of the enduring mysteries in human evolution is the evolution of the human penis. It turns out that if you look at our near ape relatives, the penis is very small. Chimpanzees have basically a pinky finger sized penis, right?
Yeah.
And so the expansion in size and in surface complexity, is not necessary for fertilization itself. Why did that evolve? Why would I hypothesize that is an ornament? What is that ornament for? Well, I think it's for providing pleasure, in particular, pleasure to females during sexual interactions, right? And that the chimpanzees and gorillas don't have a lot of mate choice. They don't exercise choice, so they couldn't expand the pleasure of sex because they don't have any opportunity for choice. But in human evolution, I think both males and females have exercised elaborate choices that have really transformed human biology.
Just so I understand, so what you believe is that males have bigger penises because the
Females prefer them.
because females prefer them, and so if they may or have sex with a guy with a bigger penis, then they will get more pleasure, and then it's more likely that she will choose the guy with the bigger penis because she will get more pleasure.
Well, of course, they're not infinitely big, right? So right,
the right size.
No doubt about it. That diversity is both in what's desirable and what's available are both there, right? In other words, but selecting on the tactile properties of choice of mating, of sexual relations, led to an elaboration in both the complexity of what that could be and the material capacity to provide it.
Right, but are there any studies of this, or is this a hypothesis? Or
well, I mean, there are lots of really bad studies of other explanations.
Okay,
right. So for example, one of them is that one of the hypotheses is that the shape of the glans of the human penis, which is distinct to humans and not found in other apes, it was a device for extracting sperm of other males that had previously mated with a female.
Right.
So this is an anti-sperm competition device, right? And so this was studied by a set of researchers who went to a sex shop and purchased lifelike sex toys that were made by porn stars, and then they experimented with cornstarch, and they found that the lifelike penis did a better job of extracting the cornstarch pasty solution from the model vagina than did a slim, unornamented dildo of the same size, right? So they then pursued that, but unfortunately, they haven't thought through this because there's lots more sperm competition in chimpanzees, right? Chimpanzees all females have multiple matings with multiple males.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so, and their penis is entirely unornamented, right? And chimpanzees have both larger testes in size, but also in hugely much larger in relative size because chimpanzees are smaller than humans, right? So they have bigger balls to produce lots and lots of sperm. So we have smaller testes, right? Which means that sperm competition has been less of a problem in human evolution. So this concept is solving an evolutionary problem that doesn't exist, right? Mm. Which is, of course, if it was useful, then chimpanzees would love to have it. So if that mechanical solution applied, then chimpanzees should have it. But they don't have it because it's a silly idea, right? I think, do people ask women whether penises are pleasurable? Obviously that research it should clearly be done, but because people have been trying to struggle to make the human body a series of adaptive ornaments, as opposed to seeing it as a product of aesthetic evolution, they haven't even done that as science. But of course, clearly, I think that concept is a slam dunk, right? I mean, yeah, I think it's pretty clear.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So what you're saying is basically that the shape of the penis is for pleasure. It's not for getting other semen out of there.
Exactly, and the penis is like as I described in the book, a piece of interactive sculpture that is first to be regarded visually and then tactily, and that both of those can be sources of sexual pleasure, and that is how we got the way we are. Of course, now usually when you think about mate choice, you think by the time mating has happened, then it's over. But in fact, in humans, most of sexuality has nothing to do with reproduction, right? And even in unprotected non-birth control populations among non-pregnant, non-lactating women, intercourse is I think the frequency is less than 20% would lead to potential fertilization, right? So that means what this is really about is about mating and remating choice, right? So it's about remating with the individual that provides the most pleasure. Now, in the book, I also talk about the evolution of orgasm, particularly female orgasm, which has been a persistent conundrum in evolutionary. Yeah. Because it doesn't do anything, right? It doesn't affect fertilization success. It doesn't affect fitness. What is it good for, right? Well, I propose that it is an example of the evolution of pleasure for its own sake, by mating and remating with males that provide the most pleasure. Females are both enhancing the richness of sexual pleasure and their own pleasure, and that is actually a novel evolutionary idea that's grown out of the aesthetic perspective. I think Darwin was not ready to go there, but now
was the wrong time.
Yeah, it was. Maybe he thought it, and he was just unwilling to talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so your point of view is, or what you believe is that the orgasm is there because if a woman has an orgasm with a man, then she will she will like that man more and choose men such that will give her orgasms.
Right, and that will lead not only to an expansion of the pleasure of sex in general, but of her own or her daughter's own capacity to experience that pleasure.
Right. But are there no studies that show any other benefits of a female orgasm?
Well, this is a really contentious subject. That's the subject of an entire book by Elizabeth Lloyd, who's a historian and philosopher of science at the University of Indiana. And there is a very active research in this area, and her book was like a devastating takedown of this field. So it is some of the worst science I think you could ever. Okay. And it's very bad, poor science, and I think that it's a failure. It's certainly true that there is no fertilization, there's no direct fertility result, impact.
Right.
Right.
So there's no studies that it will increase fertility or anything like that.
Yeah.
That is are good.
Yeah. It's reviewed in Lloyd's book so well that I didn't have to do that in my book. But that's discussed there.
Right. So then perhaps it's like you say that it's there for her own for women's own pleasure, and of course
and this is a distinctly if you will, distinctly feminist discovery in evolutionary biology, which is not necessarily a place where one expects that to happen, right? That what this theory proposes is that females that orgasm is both the direct and ultimate product of females getting what they want.
Yeah.
Having their needs met and seeking and having the opportunity for pleasure. And that has both expanded tremendously since our common ancestry with chimpanzees. Copulation in chimpanzees lasts on average 7 seconds. Right. That's it. And so it's quite clear there's not a lot of pleasure going on in either case. And so Understanding both the expansion of sexual function in diversity in human lives and the expansion of pleasure is a big part of trying to understand the human, I think.
Right. But I think now that I think about it, that there's bonding between the partners when when a woman gets an orgasm.
Sure. But that bonding can lead either to, as many humans know, to the maintenance or the dissolution of any pair bond, right?
Yeah.
Pleasure both can contribute and undermine, a monogamy, if you will, and so that idea doesn't fly.
Okay, interesting. I think it's been really, really nice talking to you about this, and I'm sure I learned a lot. Is there something like, do you have a take-home message from today that you would like to get out there?
Yeah, I think it's the idea that the evolution of subjective experience, the capacity for sensory richness, for evaluation, for judgment, and for example, pleasure, is an active force in nature. That animals can be agents in their own evolution, and that this aspect of nature just refuses to be simplified or reduced to another kind of adaptation. And so whether it's flowers in the garden, bird songs, or just the beautiful plumages of birds, aesthetic features in nature are all around us, and they refuse to be reduced into mere utility. And I think that's a beautiful thing, a beautiful statement to be able to make scientifically.
I think that's a very good take-home message. So for people that want to learn more, we got your book titled in English. It's The Evolution of Beauty. In Swedish, it's Skönhetens evolution. And if somebody would like to learn more, or perhaps to find more things that you have done, where can people find you?
Well, I'm at Yale University in the United States, and Googling my name, Richard Prum, will pull up my website, and a huge number of my papers are available there for anybody to read.
Perfect. Richard, it's been a real pleasure. Big thank you for the work that you've done and for taking time to spread your knowledge.
Thank you. Thanks. It's been fun.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Friends, I really need your help. I'm trying to get the podcast out there. So I was wondering if you could help me by leaving a positive rating and a review on your Apple device or the podcast player that you're using, as well as subscribing to the podcast. That really helps getting the show more visible on iTunes and other players. And if you don't know how it's done, then YouTube has a lot of great videos, so you can search there. All right, that's it. Take care.